Ben sat on the edge of the couch, nursing a drink he barely sipped, his mind elsewhere as the party buzzed around him. Lucas, his best friend for as long as he could remember, was in the center of the room, as usual. His laugh carried across the space, infectious, drawing people toward him like moths to a flame. Ben watched him, feeling that familiar mixture of admiration and unease. Lucas had always been the confident one, the charmer, the one who could walk into any room and command attention. It was a gift, really, but also a curse, though Lucas never seemed to notice the danger lurking beneath his own magnetic pull. Tonight, it was Mr. Charles who had been caught in Lucas's orbit. The elderly man, with his salt and pepper hair perfectly combed back, was watching Lucas with an intensity that Ben didn't like. There was something unsettling about the way he leaned forward whenever Lucas spoke, as though he were absorbing every word, feeding on the energy that Lucas so effortlessly radiated. Ben felt a knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was jealousy or something more sinister. Lucas, oblivious as ever, was basking in the attention. He had met Mr. Charles a few weeks ago at a charity event, where the old man had made a point of introducing himself. Ben had been there too, of course, but Mr. Charles had hardly glanced his way. It was Lucas he was interested in, and from that night on, they'd seen more and more of the man. He was rich, cultured, and he seemed to have connections everywhere. To Lucas, Mr. Charles represented an opportunity, a way to network, to be seen, to climb higher in the world he so desperately wanted to be a part of. Ben wasn't so sure. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about Mr. Charles set off alarm bells in his mind. Maybe it was the way he seemed to always have a hand on Lucas's shoulder, or the way his eyes never quite left Lucas's face, as though he were studying him. Or maybe it was the stories he'd heard, whispered in half-truths and rumors, about the things Mr. Charles had done in his younger years. Whatever it was, Ben didn't trust him, and he didn't like the way Lucas was being drawn into his orbit. The evening wore on, and Ben found himself slipping further into the background. The guests moved around him, laughing and talking, but it all seemed distant, as though he were watching it from behind glass. Lucas and Mr. Charles were seated together now, talking in low voices, their heads close. Ben couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw the way Mr. Charles touched Lucas's arm, the way Lucas leaned in, eager for whatever it was the older man was offering. Something inside Ben twisted. He wanted to stand up, to walk over there and pull Lucas away, to remind him that they didn't know this man, not really. But he didn't move. Instead, he sat there, frozen in place by his own uncertainty. What if he was wrong? What if this was all in his head? Lucas would never forgive him if he ruined this opportunity because of some baseless suspicion. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger as the night went on, gnawing at him until he couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, muttering something about needing air, and made his way outside. The cool night air hit his face like a slap, and he breathed it in, trying to clear his head. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the city below. The lights flickered like stars, distant and unreachable. Just like Lucas, he thought bitterly. He stayed out there for a long time, long enough for the party inside to start winding down. When he finally went back in, most of the guests had left. The house was quiet now, eerily so, and Ben's unease returned in full force. He walked through the empty rooms, searching for Lucas, but he was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until he reached the hallway that led to the bedrooms that he heard it. Voices, low and muffled, coming from behind a closed door. Ben's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. Lucas. He stood there for a moment, his hand hovering over the door handle, unsure of what to do. His mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. What if something was happening in there? What if Lucas needed him? But what if he was wrong? What if this was none of his business? In the end, it was the sound of Lucas's voice, soft and uncertain, that made the decision for him. He pushed the door open, just a crack, and peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Lucas was on the bed, his shirt half unbuttoned, and Mr. Charles was leaning over him, his hand on Lucas's chest. Lucas looked confused, uncertain, and for the first time, Ben saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. Ben stood there in the doorway, frozen. He wanted to move, to shout, to do something, but his feet were glued to the floor. He watched as Mr. Charles leaned in closer, his hand moving down Lucas's chest, and Lucas didn't stop him. Ben's mind screamed at him to move, but his body refused to obey. It wasn't until Lucas finally pushed Mr. Charles's hand away, his voice shaking as he said, "I think we should stop," that Ben snapped out of it. He pushed the door open the rest of the way, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell is going on in here?" he demanded, his voice louder than he intended. Both Lucas and Mr. Charles looked up, startled. Lucas's face was flushed, and he quickly scrambled off the bed, buttoning his shirt. "Ben, it's not what you think," he started, but Ben wasn't listening. He was staring at Mr. Charles, his fists clenched at his sides. The old man's expression was calm, almost amused, as though this were all some kind of game to him. "I think you should leave," Ben said through gritted teeth, his eyes locked on Mr. Charles. For a moment, it looked like Mr. Charles was going to argue, but then he stood up, smoothing out his suit jacket. "Very well," he said, his voice smooth and unbothered. "I'll be in touch, Lucas." And with that, he walked past Ben, his eyes lingering on him for just a moment before he disappeared down the hallway. Ben turned to Lucas, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "What the hell was that, Lucas? Why didn't you stop him?" Lucas looked down, avoiding Ben's gaze. "I don't know," he muttered. "I didn't think it was a big deal." "He didn't do anything." "Not really." Ben stared at him, incredulous. "Not a big deal. Lucas, that man was about to take advantage of you." Lucas flinched at Ben's words, but he didn't argue. He just sat down on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "I don't know, Ben. Maybe you're right. I didn't want to make a scene." Ben sighed, the anger slowly draining out of him, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. He sat down next to Lucas, putting a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to put up with that, you know. You deserve better." Lucas nodded, but he didn't say anything. They sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air, then remained silent, trying to make sense of everything that had just transpired. Lucas had always been so strong, so sure of himself, but tonight, Ben had seen a side of him he hadn't expected, a vulnerability that unnerved him. It wasn't just about Mr. Charles anymore. It was about something deeper, something Ben hadn't realized about Lucas until now. "I don't know why I let him get so close," Lucas finally whispered, his voice breaking the silence between them. He kept his gaze on the floor, refusing to meet Ben's eyes. "I mean, he's old enough to be my father." "I knew something was off, but I guess I didn't want to believe it." Ben's chest tightened with empathy. Lucas had always been confident, but maybe that confidence masked insecurities that he rarely showed. It wasn't easy for him to open up, even to Ben, and this moment felt fragile, like the truth was just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. "You didn't do anything wrong," Ben said softly, choosing his words carefully. "People like Mr. Charles, they know how to manipulate. He took advantage of your trust." Lucas let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, I sure made it easy for him. I should have seen the signs. But he made me feel, I don't know, important. Like I was special. And I liked that. I didn't want it to be fake." Ben shifted on the bed, leaning in closer. "Lucas, you're special. You don't need some creepy old guy to tell you that. You've always been the most incredible person I know. You don't have to let someone like him define your worth." Lucas finally looked up, his eyes tired and filled with doubt. "Maybe," he muttered. "But I don't know if I believe that right now." Ben squeezed his shoulder. He could feel the tension in Lucas's body, the weight of everything they weren't saying. He didn't push further, knowing that Lucas needed time to process what had happened. But inside, Ben was boiling. Mr. Charles had crossed a line, and Ben wasn't about to let it go. The days that followed were tense. Lucas withdrew into himself, avoiding both Ben and Mr. Charles. He didn't talk about that night, and whenever Ben brought it up, Lucas would change the subject or brush it off, insisting that he was fine. But Ben knew better. He could see the way Lucas was struggling, even if he wouldn't admit it. Ben's anger toward Mr. Charles only grew. He started digging into the man's past, searching for anything that could explain his behavior. What he found didn't surprise him. Rumors, accusations, whispers of manipulation, all buried under layers of wealth and connections. Mr. Charles had a history, and it wasn't pretty. Ben confronted Lucas with the information, but Lucas didn't want to hear it. I don't care about his past, Lucas snapped one night, his voice tight with frustration. It's over. I just want to move on. But you can't just ignore it. Ben argued, his voice rising. He's dangerous, Lucas. He's done this before, and he'll do it again. You're not the only one he's manipulated. Lucas stood up from the couch, pacing the room as if trying to escape the conversation. I know, Ben. Okay. I know. But what do you want me to do? Go to the police. They won't do anything. He didn't actually. He didn't have to, Ben interrupted. He crossed a line, and you know it. You need to stand up for yourself. Lucas stopped pacing, his back to Ben. He was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice low. I'm scared, Ben. I don't want to deal with this. I just want it to go away. Ben's heart sank. He had never seen Lucas so defeated. He stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to deal with this alone. I'm here, and so is Sophia. We'll figure this out together. Sophia had been a friend of theirs for years, strong and sharp-witted, the kind of person who never backed down from a fight. Ben knew that if anyone could help them, it was her. And as much as Lucas wanted to pretend everything was fine, Ben wasn't about to let Mr. Charles get away with what he'd done. It took some convincing, but eventually, Lucas agreed to let Sophia in on what had happened. When they sat down with her a few days later, she listened carefully, her face unreadable as Lucas recounted the events. She didn't interrupt, didn't push him for more details than he was willing to give, but when he was finished, her expression hardened. That son of a bitch, she muttered under her breath, her eyes blazing with fury. He thinks he can just get away with this. Lucas flinched slightly at her intensity, but Ben could see the relief in his eyes. He needed someone like Sophia, someone who could take the reins when he couldn't. Sophia wasn't the type to sit back and let things slide. She immediately began planning. We're not going to let him off the hook, she said, her voice firm. But we have to be smart about this. We can't just go in guns blazing. We need to gather evidence, get witnesses, people who've been in similar situations. If we can prove a pattern, we can take him down. Lucas looked uncertain, but Ben nodded. This was exactly what they needed, action, a plan, something to fight back with. The days that followed were a whirlwind of strategy and subtle investigations. Sophia's contacts helped them dig deeper into Mr. Charles's past, uncovering stories from people who had been silenced or paid off. Slowly, piece by piece, they built their case. Lucas was hesitant at first, still grappling with his own guilt and shame. But as more stories surfaced, as more people came forward, his resolve hardened. He began to realize that this wasn't just about him. It was about stopping a man who had hurt others and would continue to hurt more if no one stopped him. The turning point came when Lucas finally agreed to meet with one of Mr. Charles's former victims, a man named Peter. Peter's story mirrored Lucas's in chilling detail, and as they sat together, Peter explained how Mr. Charles had manipulated him, too, luring him in with promises of success and connections, only to cross boundaries in ways that left him feeling violated and confused. I thought I could handle it, Peter said, his voice quiet but steady. But it messed with my head. He's good at what he does, making you feel like it's all your fault, like you wanted it. But it's not your fault, Lucas. None of this is your fault. Lucas sat in silence for a long time after Peter left, his eyes focused on the ground. Ben didn't push him. He knew Lucas needed time to process everything, to come to terms with what had happened. When Lucas finally spoke, his voice was filled with a quiet determination that Ben hadn't heard in weeks. We're going to stop him, he said, his jaw set. I'm not going to let him do this to anyone else. It wasn't easy, but with Sophia's help, they built a case strong enough to expose Mr. Charles. They found others who were willing to come forward, people who had been hurt by him in the past but had been too scared to speak out. Together, they confronted Mr. Charles, forcing him to face the consequences of his actions. The fallout was swift and brutal. Mr. Charles's reputation crumbled, and he was forced to face the legal system he had once thought he was above. For Lucas, it was a bittersweet victory. He had won, but the cost had been high. In the aftermath, Lucas and Ben's friendship grew stronger, though it was forever changed by what they had been through. Lucas had learned to stand up for himself, to see his own worth without needing validation from others. And Ben had learned the importance of speaking up, of trusting his instincts, even when it was hard. As they sat together one evening, watching the sunset from the rooftop of their apartment building, Lucas turned to Ben with a small smile. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Ben shrugged, his eyes on the horizon. "You would have found a way. You're stronger than you think." Lucas laughed softly. "Maybe. But it helps knowing I've got people like you and Sophia in my corner." Ben smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. They had been through hell, but they had come out the other side stronger. And in the end, that was what mattered most. As the weeks passed, life slowly returned to something resembling normalcy, though neither Lucas nor Ben could forget what had happened. Lucas threw himself into his work, trying to rebuild his confidence and reclaim the parts of himself that had been shaken by Mr. Charles's betrayal. Ben, on the other hand, found himself more watchful than ever, always looking out for his friend, ready to step in if Lucas needed him. But Lucas didn't need rescuing anymore. He had changed, become more cautious, perhaps, but also more resilient. One evening, as they sat in their usual spot on the rooftop, Lucas broke the silence that had settled between them. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been there that night?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Ben turned to him, a frown creasing his brow. "I don't like to think about it," he admitted. "But yeah, sometimes I do." Lucas nodded, his gaze distant as he looked out over the city. "I do too. And I hate that. I hate that I was so blind to it all. I trusted him, Ben. I really thought he wanted to help me." "It wasn't your fault," Ben said firmly. "You know that, right? He manipulated you, just like he did with Peter and all the others. People like Mr. Charles, they're good at making you feel like you're the one to blame. But you're not." Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know that now. But it's still hard to shake the feeling that I let it happen." Ben didn't know what to say. He had said it all before, and Lucas had heard it all before. But the healing process wasn't something that happened overnight. It took time, and even though Lucas was getting stronger, Ben knew it would be a while before he fully believed that none of this had been his fault. After a long pause, Lucas turned to Ben with a small, grateful smile. "I'm really lucky to have you, you know. I don't think I've ever told you that enough." Ben shrugged, a little uncomfortable with the sudden sincerity. "You don't have to. I'm just glad you're okay." Lucas's smile widened, and for a moment, Ben saw a glimmer of the old Lucas, the carefree, confident friend who could light up any room he walked into. But there was something new in his expression too. A quiet strength, a deeper understanding of the world and the people in it. Lucas wasn't the same person he had been before Mr. Charles, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. "You know," Lucas said after a moment, "I've been thinking about something. I don't want to just move on and pretend this never happened. I want to help people like Peter, who went through the same thing. Maybe I can't fix what happened to me, but I can stop it from happening to someone else." Ben looked at him, surprised by the determination in his voice. "How are you going to do that?" "I don't know yet," Lucas admitted. "But I want to do something. Maybe start an organization or join a group that helps people who've been through stuff like this. I don't want Mr. Charles, or anyone like him, to get away with this ever again." Ben nodded, impressed by his friend's resolve. "That sounds like a good idea. I think you'd be great at it." Lucas smiled, a real smile this time, and Ben could see that he meant it. "Thanks," he said softly. I want to make sure something good comes out of all of this." As the weeks turned into months, Lucas followed through on his promise. He began volunteering with organizations that supported survivors of abuse and manipulation, sharing his story in the hopes of helping others find their own strength. It wasn't easy, there were days when the memories still haunted him, when the anger and shame threatened to pull him back into that dark place, but Lucas fought through it. And with every person he helped, with every story he listened to, he grew stronger. Ben watched all of this with quiet pride. He had always known Lucas was strong, but now he was seeing a new kind of strength, one born out of pain, but also out of hope. Lucas wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving, using his experiences to make a difference in the world. Their friendship, too, had deepened in ways Ben hadn't expected. They had always been close, but after everything they had been through, there was a new level of trust between them. Ben no longer felt like he was standing in Lucas's shadow, and Lucas no longer felt the need to hide his vulnerabilities. They had seen each other at their lowest, and they had come out the other side stronger for it. One day, as they sat together on the rooftop, Lucas turned to Ben with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. Ben laughed, leaning back against the railing. "All the time. I mean, a year ago, I couldn't have imagined any of this." Lucas nodded, his gaze drifting over the skyline. "Me neither. But I think I'm finally starting to feel like myself again. Maybe even better than before." "You are better than before," Ben said quietly. "You're stronger. And you're doing something that really matters." Lucas smiled, the kind of smile that lit up his entire face. "Yeah," he said softly. "I guess I am." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shades of orange and pink, Ben felt a sense of peace settle over him. It hadn't been an easy journey, but they had made it. Lucas had found his strength, and Ben had found his place by his side. They were different now, wiser, more cautious, but also more determined to face whatever came next. And whatever the future held, Ben knew they would face it together.